I want competition with China, not conflict. And we're in a stronger position to win the conflict of the 21st century against China than anyone else, for that matter, than any time as well.
When it comes to the relationship between the United States and China, competition, not conflict, is the slogan used by American and Chinese politicians alike to describe the ideal dynamic between the two largest economies in the world. Currently, tensions are at an all-time high between the two powers.
But the China-US relationship is facing more negative factors and all kinds of disruptions.
China has admitted that a suspected spy balloon which has entered US airspace is theirs, but says it is a civilian airship.
Beijing has accused Washington of causing trouble after the US Navy sailed a warship through the sensitive Taiwan Strait.
We need to find ways to pressure and raise the pressure, frankly, on Beijing.
With China claiming the United States is restricting its ability to grow, with new trade policies popping up left and right.
Meanwhile, U.S.-China trade tensions are sparking once again. The U.S. considering raising tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles.
Beijing prohibits the export of rare earth metals processing technology, while Washington announces a survey to identify U.S. firms' reliance on Chinese so-called legacy chips.
President Biden looking to triple tariffs on Chinese metals.
It all boils down to one thing: playing fair. Welcome to Dear China. I'm Susan St. Dennis, and today we're going to be looking at one of the most significant trade policies in U.S.-China relations, the open door policy. I hope you stick around. When it comes to the relationship between the United States and China, the idea of a free and equal playing field is hardly new. But it didn't start with the famous handshake between Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong, nor did it start with China's historic entrance into the World Trade Organization. It actually goes a lot farther back than that, to the turn of the 19th century, when the United States was trying to make a name for herself. As the 19th century came to a close, the United States was at a crossroads. A little over 120 years old, the young country struggled to keep up with the European superpowers, especially when it came to China. The country's growth had stalled during its recovery from the Civil War, which had torn it in half, but by the 1890s, the United States was ready to stake its claim on the world. America had made a name for itself as an industrial powerhouse. By the 1860s, the United States was second only to Great Britain and France in manufacturing. The country was rapidly expanding, and concepts like manifest destiny injected Americans with an unrivaled confidence. To them, the world was their oyster, and all of its pearls could be rightfully possessed by them by any means. China was no exception. America's very identity was wrapped up in China. The founding fathers took great inspiration from Chinese intellectuals like Confucius when trying to create a country distinct from its European roots. In order to prove America's independence, in 1784, the Empress of China was one of the country's first international missions, sailing to establish trade relations with the Qing dynasty. By the late 1800s, China was the United States' second largest trading partner. By the late 1800s, China had been severely weakened thanks to its failures in the First and Second Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the First Sino-Japanese War. Each conflict ended with an unequal treaty signed by Western powers that slowly chipped away at China's sovereignty. China was labeled the sick man of Asia by European powers. The country's vulnerability left its resources ripe for the picking, and there was an imminent threat of the country being partitioned and colonized by the imperial powers present in China at the time: France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Japan, and Russia. This proved to be especially concerning for the United States. Their trade relationship with China had been languishing for decades, but at the turn of the 20th century, trade had finally started to pick back up. The renewed enthusiasm for the Chinese market was so great that it motivated the creation of the Panama Canal, which cut through Central America to speed up travel to the Far East. American businessmen in China were even calling for the United States to come to China's aid in light of Europe's scramble for China. All of Europe is seizing China, warned Henry Cabot Lodge, a senator from Massachusetts. If we do not establish ourselves in the East, the vast trade from which we must draw our future prosperity will be practically closed to us forever. In 1899, the United States carried out trade through only one Chinese port, and with European powers expanding their influence around them, the United States was worried American trade would be cut out altogether. But the United States couldn't afford to go head-to-head with imperial giants like the British. The intimidating explorer and ex-diplomat William Rockhill, known as the first American to learn Tibetan, and U.S. Secretary of State John Hayes rose to the occasion. To them, the territorial integrity of China was vital to long-term U.S. interests. A third of China's trade was carried in American ships. China was buying half of American cotton exports, and the United States needed an outpost in China if they were going to maintain control of the Philippines. But more importantly, there was a widespread belief that China was key to America's growth. The United States had rapidly become a manufacturing powerhouse, but was running out of new markets. There was a real concern that the economy could collapse. But China boasted a population of 400 million untapped consumers. Few understood that this perception of China as a mystical realm of economic opportunity completely overlooked the poverty and low purchasing power of the population. All that mattered was that there seemed to be an opportunity for the United States to lead the international community and take its place among the major world powers. From this, the open door policy was born. It arose from a series of notes from Rockhill to Hayes, distributed to the European powers, asking Europe to keep China open to trade with all countries on an equal basis. It was a groundbreaking suggestion, rooted in diplomatic transparency. Hayes believed that through collective guarantee of equal commercial opportunities, a regulated market in China could bring prosperity to everyone. The United States, however, had no way to enforce the idea. The European powers agreed on the surface, but did little to actually meet expectations. After all, it was an informal agreement, much like the Monroe Doctrine, which meant its durability could easily be tested. Nonetheless, the agreement spurred praise, with the open door policy labeled a noble work of peace. There was just one glaring issue. The Qing court was never consulted. The open door policy was by no means an attempt to stop imperialist behavior. Rather, it was repackaged as commercial exploitation. China was unprepared and unable to keep up with the influx of foreign business. China's fate was still being determined by outside powers, and the public was quickly growing tired of foreign intervention. When the Boxer Rebellion started in 1899, it stemmed largely from the wide foreign control over China's economic affairs, something which the open door policy only further encouraged. For the largely impoverished public, who had also experienced an array of natural disasters, foreign influence was to blame for China's weakened state. They marched through the country, killing Westerners and Chinese Christians. Their religious status granted them privileges in the eyes of the rebels. But Western powers did little to intervene in the beginning. William Rockhill addressed John Hayes' concerns about the movement, saying that, "I cannot believe the Boxer movement will be very long-lived or cause any serious complications. The day the Chinese authorities choose to put an end to it, they can easily do so." It revealed just how disconnected from the realities of the Chinese population American leadership was, especially when Empress Dowager Cixi backed the rebels and declared that Westerners had to be eliminated. Such a declaration threatened to close the open door the United States had just established and could bring further instability. One reason why the United States pushed against the colonization of China was that they believed a stable Qing dynasty was to the benefit of American business interests. Collaboration would bring more profit than conflict. Even when Cixi declared a state of war on foreigners, John Hayes maintained that the United States was not at war with China. So driven was leadership to keeping China whole and maintaining relations that the Secretary of War at the time, Lai Hu-Root, declared that allowing China to be divided would be second to no event in its effect upon mankind since the fall of the Roman Empire. When the United States eventually sent 49 officers and 1,151 enlisted men to China to combat the Boxers, it was done so under the operation label of China Relief Mission, to avoid any war declarations. It was still an invasion, and President William McKinley became the first president in U.S. history to order the full-scale invasion of a sovereign country without seeking legislative approval. Congress didn't oppose the action. The Boxer Rebellion became a highly followed event by the American public, and the narrative presented to them was that the United States was better behaved than the feuding, imperialistic European civilization. The reality was, Americans in China in the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion engaged in looting. Those who had experienced violence at the hands of the Boxers took it upon themselves to act as judge and jury, traveling through China to enact revenge on Boxer sympathizers by seizing land and homes. Others called for Chinese policy to be controlled by Westerners. As these events became known to the American public, discourse spread throughout the country. The Boxer Rebellion became not only a threat to China's stability, but also became an American domestic issue as Americans began to sympathize with the Boxer cause. Anti-Chinese sentiment was rampant in the United States at the time. Anti-immigration sentiment had taken root in the United States throughout the 1800s, and hard economic times in the 1870s led to economic competition between Chinese immigrants and white Americans, spurring violence. In the mid-1880s, at least 168 communities in the United States forced their Chinese residents to leave. The Boxer cause of removing foreigners became appealing to those who viewed immigrants as the reason for their economic strife. A Harper's Weekly article published at the time stated that the Boxer insurrection expanded into a national movement, having for its purpose the expulsion of all foreigners, or, as we would express it, China for the Chinese. The average American possesses the candor to acknowledge that, far from being unreasonable, this purpose was patriotic and laudable. For the United States government, this was concerning, not because it threatened the safety of Chinese and other immigrants in the country. One only needs to look at the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 to see that, but because it threatened to close the door they had worked so hard to open in China. The narrative needed to be changed in order to maintain the open door policy and the business opportunities China possessed. The Boxers were not fighting foreign interventionism. What they were fighting was progress. They were rebels against civilization. This narrative played into domestic attitudes towards Chinese immigrants, who were labeled as dangerous threats to American civilization. But it also presented the idea that they could be molded and changed into good Chinese. A paternalistic image of the United States was painted, one that would use its influence and economic strength to spread the ideals of freedom, democracy, and other Western values by means of negotiation rather than warfare, or at least without labeling something as warfare. It was clear to American leadership that China was still in the midst of being divided, not necessarily for the gaining of territory, but instead business ventures and hopes to be the country that civilized China. Having significant influence over one of the largest countries in the world would be monumental. This narrative only further amplified the positive reception of the open door policy, as it was viewed as a victory of American civilization over feuding, imperialistic European civilization. It also presented a new image of China, a China that could be molded and transformed. The idea of China, its potential, its market, these things were looked upon fondly. The end of the Boxer Rebellion is significant in that regard. The rebellion had proved the importance of China to American business. American textile factories, for example, had been forced to operate at half volume during the conflict. Business was at the forefront of the American negotiations when the demands of the Boxer Protocol were discussed. Hayes and President McKinley sent William Rockhill and the United States Minister to China, Edwin Conger, to handle the negotiations on America's behalf and to protect her profits. The Europeans came to the table with harsh demands. The Germans, for example, wanted to put all Chinese officials who had supported the uprising to death. Some even pushed for a fortress to be built next to the Forbidden City. The United States, however, managed to remove these demands and even lowered China's indemnity by 30%. In the end, the Qing dynasty paid the equivalent to $7 billion today. Rockhill also specifically asked for China to open its doors to American investment, create a stable national currency, and protect American trademarks. The Qing dynasty, however, still struggled to pay, especially when all of the countries involved demanded the payment be made in gold as opposed to silver, which would be beneficial to these countries, but it would add a burden to Chinese finance. The court sent Liang Cheng, who had been a star baseball player during his days studying in the United States, to negotiate on China's behalf. This led to another opportunity for the United States in regards to its business interests, creating ideal Chinese workers. Only 7.5% of the initial indemnity was claimed by the United States, but Liang Cheng managed to successfully negotiate for the modern equivalent of $11,961,121.76 to be refunded to China in order to build educational institutions and finance Chinese student studies in the United States. These funds led to the establishment of Tsinghua University and the Boxer Indemnity Scholarship, which was labeled by President Roosevelt as a chance for American-directed reform in China that could improve U.S.-China relations and raise America's standing in the world. The United States had successfully presented itself as a guardian against imperialism, using the open door policy to enforce a fair playing field for all. In reality, the United States was guarding its own business endeavors, as can be seen in repeated failures of the United States to come to China's aid, as Russia and then Japan invaded and took territories. For example, in 1903, one of Liang Cheng's intentions was not only to decrease the financial burden on the Qing dynasty, but also to protect China's territory. At the end of the Boxer Rebellion, Russia invaded and took over Manchuria. Liang hoped he could get the United States to act on China's behalf by inciting open-door values. But a New York Times article written during Liang Cheng's negotiations revealed the true nature of the policy. So long as the United States secures and retains trade in Manchuria, it will not be drawn into the political complications of the present situation. The concerns for China presented by the United States were directed more at the idea of China rather than at the people themselves. What could China be rather than what China is, which, in my opinion, is part of the reason why the United States was not willing to bleed for China. Because of how widespread American influence is today, I think people forget that at its core, America is historically isolationist. Earlier, we talked about how the United States labeled its troops in China during the Boxer Rebellion as the China Relief Mission to distance itself from direct involvement, even if the actions carried out went against this. When the United States eventually came to China's aid in World War II, this was still labeled as a mission to train, reform, or influence rather than direct intervention. It's interesting how this era of the open door policy is interpreted in regards to U.S.-China relations today. In 2018, the Trump administration gave its first major policy speech on China, with then Vice President Mike Pence stating that
when China suffered through indignities and exploitations during her so-called century of humiliation, America refused to join in and advocated the open door policy so that we could have freer trade with China and preserve their sovereignty.
The reality, however, is a lot more complex. The open door policy was not benevolent. It was a strategy to get the United States a seat at the table. At the time of its establishment, what the United States lacked in military capability, it made up for with business ingenuity by enforcing this policy not through force, but rather through profits. Everyone had an equal opportunity in China's market, except for China. As tensions between the United States and China continue to escalate, fueled by accusations of unfair trade practices and economic dominance, the complexities of their relationship remain at the forefront of global affairs. While both nations advocate for competition over conflict, the pursuit of economic interests often blurs the lines between fairness and exploitation. This can even be seen in criticisms towards the establishment of U.S.-China relations in 1979. At the time, dreams of reforming China once again appeared. Businessmen once more scrambled to China to make a name for themselves. Instead of 400 million unreached consumers, there were now over 1 billion. 45 years later, there are some who say establishing relations with China was a diplomatic blunder because the United States failed to mold China. Instead, it created an enemy. But I think this comes from a tendency to create a fantasy of China rather than looking at and understanding what is there in reality. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed. I'm making the transition from TikTok over to YouTube, so I apologize for the janky setup. Hopefully, as I get used to making videos here, the quality will improve. But if you want to learn more about Chinese history, politics, news, and more, make sure you click that subscribe button because there's going to be a lot more videos to come. Until next time, bye y'all!